Over 100 years ago, in August 1920, one of the most important battles in the history of Republic of Poland took place on the outskirts of Warsaw. It was also the greatest triumph of Polish army since John III's victory of Vienna in 1683. British politician and diplomat Lord D'Abernon described it as the 18th most decisive battle in the world's history. And when I add names of Piłsudski, Rozwadowski or Sikorski, it is obvious that we're going to be exploring the world of Battle of Warsaw. Do you know how much time Poland had to celebrate peace and independence? Merely a week, because on the 17th of November 1918, Leo Trotsky gave a speech where he claimed that Poland should be Sovietized in order to make it not a wedge, but a link between the Soviet Russia and Soviet Germany. On the same day, Joseph Stalin published an article where he called Poland one of the dwarf national governments, creating a partition between East and West, a partition that needed to be diminished or even totally destroyed. So on the 18th of November, by the order of Vladimir Lenin, the Operation Vistula began. Poland regained its independence on the 11th of November 1918. So Poland should be celebrating. But what happened then?
Poland regained its independence verbally, meaning that the great powers gave us what we had waited for throughout the 19th century, permission for Poland to exist. But whether there would be a Poland, and what kind of Poland it would be, depended entirely on us. No one was going to come fight for us. Europe wouldn't have sent a single soldier because it was completely bled dry by the World War. We were left to rely on ourselves in a country utterly devastated by the war. It's important to remember what the greatest threat was. Poland lay directly on the path of the Red Army's march westward. While here in Warsaw, we were celebrating the great feast of independence, and in Krakow, people rejoiced and cried with joy. Over in Moscow, the decision had already been made. Poland must disappear. Poland was merely a partition wall, as Trotsky said, a flimsy partition separating the Russian Revolution from Europe. And that is why Poland, this little country, had to disappear. The war with Bolshevik Russia was a war for the very existence of the Polish state, because Poland and Bolshevik Russia had completely asymmetrical goals. Russia aimed for a global revolution. Meanwhile, we only aimed to restore the old Poland in a new territorial and political form.
I think it is fair to paraphrase words of Winston Churchill and say, rarely is so much owed by so many to one battle. Because if it hadn't been for this victory, the map of contemporary Europe could look totally different. Perhaps there wouldn't be Berlin or Paris, but there would be second Stalingrad or Leningrad. But for sure, there wouldn't be Poland on this map. Moving forward to the Battle of Warsaw, there is this common belief that it took place on the outskirts of Warsaw only. Would you agree?
W powszechnej świadomości
People often think the Battle of Warsaw took place around Warsaw, near Radzymin, or even near Ostrów, where a battalion of volunteers fought. But that couldn't be more wrong. The Battle of Warsaw was a vast strategic battle involving armies of 500,000 soldiers, fought between the Prussian border and the lines of the Vistula and Wieprz rivers, from roughly Inowrocław to Sokal, through Bieszów on the Bug River, and then along the Bug, through Brest, and further along the Neman River to Grodno. It was fought from the end of July to the end of August, for about a month, between massive forces, the Soviet Western Front and the Polish Northern and Central Fronts. A great strategic battle that determined the outcome of the war, the fate of Poland, and the fate of Europe itself. That's why it's also referred to as the Battle of the Vistula.
The most mentioned name during this battle is, of course, Józef Piłsudski, but what were other crucial players?
In every army, in every military system, it is the commander-in-chief who makes the final decision about which strategic concept should be carried out. Of course, the commander-in-chief always has, and this is very important, a general staff and its chief at his disposal. And a good chief of staff is a treasure to the commander-in-chief because the commander selected the concept and presented it, and the staff, based on that, developed the plan. The entire plan for the Battle of Warsaw began taking shape in early July 1920 when General Stanisław Haller was Chief of Staff. General Rozwadowski was then head of the Polish military mission in France and had no idea what was happening or unfolding across this vast operational area. Only after returning on July 19th and assuming the role of Chief of the General Staff, an appointment made by the Commander-in-Chief, did he fully immerse himself in the plan. He immediately grasped its brilliant strategic outline and implemented it consistently. And that was the genius of both Józef Piłsudski and General Rozwadowski. They understood each other perfectly and worked in close collaboration during the battle. Józef Piłsudski, as Commander-in-Chief, chose the strategy. Had he lost, public opinion would have cursed him for the rest of his life for losing Poland, not Rozwadowski.
Failure is usually an orphan, while success has many fathers. And it was also the case of the Battle of Warsaw. People still tend to argue who was more important to the win, Rozwadowski or Piłsudski. But we all know that they both played crucial roles for the victory. But there could only be one commander-in-chief. It is almost impossible to underestimate the role of Józef Piłsudski in this battle.
Józef Piłsudski was simultaneously the head of state and commander-in-chief of the Polish army during this most difficult period of rebuilding the newly reborn republic, creating its army and defending its borders, especially in the war against Bolshevik Russia, which aimed to erase Poland from the map of Europe once again.
Marshal Józef Piłsudski was a relentless fighter, a statesman, the father of reborn Poland. But he was also a charismatic leader and experienced yet sometimes ruthless politician. But who did he turn into when the battle dust settled and he came back home? Walking across these rooms in Milusin, I can truly imagine these private spaces being filled with laughter and everyday life noises of the Piłsudski's family. And I keep wondering whether daughters of Piłsudski, Wanda and Jadwiga, were as children aware of the fact that thanks to their daddy's work, future generations of Polish people, me included, would be able to speak Polish instead of having to speak Russian. What would you say was maybe not the final, but the most decisive blow that made us win this battle?
Decydującą fazą
The decisive phase of the Battle of Warsaw was not the fighting at Radzymyn or Ossów. The goal there was to draw as many Russian forces as possible toward Warsaw. The decisive Polish counter-offensive began on the morning of August 16th from the area around the Wieprz River, in the zone between the Bug and Vistula rivers, advancing northward and striking at Tukaczewski's flank. This forced him to fight with a reversed front, cutting off his supply and communication lines and surrounding his forces. The result was the capture of over 60,000 soldiers and huge numbers of wounded or killed. It was a massive loss, an absolute defeat, a defeat from which the Red Army could not recover.
If there is an image that captures the importance of the Battle of Warsaw to Poles, it must be this painting by Jerzy Kossak from 1930. This artwork is called Cud nad Wisłą, the miracle on the Vistula, as the victory itself came to be known in Poland. Winning with Soviets was so unlikely that when it happened, it gained the reputation of being a miracle. It might be also associated with the fact that on the 15th of August, the feast of Assumption of Virgin Mary is celebrated. Who knows? Would you say it was a miracle, an accident or coincidence, or a well-thought plan?
A country that had only just emerged after 126 years of occupation, out of nothing, from the dust, managed to create an army of nearly 1 million in just 2 years. It went to war with a powerful neighbor and was on the brink of collapse. In August 1920, no one in the world gave us a chance to survive. Lenin and the entire Bolshevik leadership were no longer asking how the war was going, but when Warsaw would finally fall, why it was taking so long. For Lenin, the fall of Warsaw had immense political significance. It would launch the next stage of expansion into Europe. And then came the miracle. That's how it was seen. Warsaw under threat, and suddenly a great victory. Central and Northern Europe would have become Soviet, not in 1945, but in 1920.
Maps, plans, codes, ciphers. This is war in theory. Important, and yet still only theory. But there are places around our capital that still remember the military upheaval of the Battle of Warsaw. The fortress of Modlin began its existence by the order of Napoleon, but it was the Russians who made it such colossus. These barracks are the longest military building in Europe with the length of 2,250 meters. And I can almost hear the history giggling, because what was created to confirm the influence of the Russians in this part of Europe in 1920 ended up protecting it from their dominance. What role did Modlin play during the Polish-Bolshevik War and the Battle of Warsaw?
Modlin didn't play a leading role, but it was still very important. Every army needs a logistical base. This was the largest tactical unit near Warsaw in 1920. And I'll be honest, if all of this, the supply lines, the backup, hadn't worked here, it's hard to say how the Battle of Warsaw would have turned out. When a soldier came here, there were Siberian riflemen, Greater Poland riflemen, basically soldiers from all over Poland. They were looking for shelter, massive walls, massive embankments. Here, they could rest. Here, we'd form an army. And from here, that army would set out. And that's exactly what happened. General Sikorski organized a volunteer division here. That was incredibly important. People came from the surrounding areas, poorly armed, poorly equipped, because where were we supposed to get everything from?
How did an average soldier look like during the Polish-Bolshevik War?
We had uniforms. Some were American, because the Americans helped us. The Hungarians sent us ammunition. The Polish soldier was often under-equipped and underfed, but the spirit was there. He knew, if they get here, we're gone. It's over.
So what sort of weapons did they use?
We had what was left after World War I, mostly German Mausers, loads of Russian Mosins, Mannlichers, and the weapons General Haller brought from France. Here, for example, we have a Polish military saber. Back then, there was this popular rallying cry. Lances to battle, sabers in hand, chase the Bolshevik, go, go, go! And this saber found here, it's a very valuable piece.
We tend to omit, or we tend to forget, how people also fought.
Back then, you faced your enemy face to face and you saw their blood. Using a saber or a bayonet meant blood was spraying everywhere. My grandmother, who lived through both world wars, always told me they were both horrible. But I also lived through 1920, and that was something else entirely. She once saw Bolsheviks capture a Polish cavalryman and tear him to pieces with their bare hands. They even killed the horse because it belonged to a Polish lord. That's how brutal the fighting was. When I brought her here to our fortress cemetery, among our boys from 1920, there are 2 graves of Bolsheviks. And when she saw those 2 graves, she said, "Look how they fought each other, how they hated each other, and now they lie side by side, and the even earth doesn't even crack anymore, so they must have stopped arguing." There's a very wise German saying, "Der Tod eint sie alle." Death unites everyone in the end.
Death unites, death unites. During the Battle of Warsaw, 4,500 of Polish soldiers died. 22,000 were injured and 10,000 went missing. And I think it is only just to show you a place where they were laid to rest in peace. I couldn't imagine not visiting this Warsaw Military Cemetery, where many soldiers fighting for our independence were put to sleep for eternity.
The military cemetery is the resting place of soldiers from the Polish Bolshevik War, World War I, and the Warsaw Uprising. But these 8 quarters, these hundreds of crosses around us, are almost exclusively the graves of those who fell in the Polish Bolshevik War and in the defense of Warsaw.
These are people who gave their life over 100 years ago so that right now we can live in free Poland.
Dzięki ich ofierze wtedy
Thanks to their sacrifice,
cieszyć się później
we had the chance to enjoy 20 years of independent Poland.
Wśród
Among
tych,
those
którzy
buried
tutaj
here
leżą,
are many
spoczywają,
volunteers,
jest wielu ochotników.
and to
I
me,
dla mnie szczególnym
one
bohaterem
stands
jest
out as a
on,
particular hero,
Płoszko,
Zygmunt Płoszko,
16-letni uczeń, początkujący
a 16-year-old
dobrze
pupil and a promising young
zapowiadający się
pianist
pianista,
who traded
który
his school bag for a rifle.
zamienił tornister
His
na
mother was
karabin.
also at Ossów.
Pod Ossowem
She had enlisted and served as a nurse.
ona również
On the
zaciągnęła się,
battlefield,
służyła
she
jako
searched for her
specjalista.
son
Ona na tym pobojowisku
and found him
walki
dying.
szukała swojego syna.
She took him in her
Znalazła go
arms,
w wagonie,
carried
wzięła
him,
go na ręce,
looked for a
niosła,
cart,
szukała
a horse, called out for a doctor,
krzyczała lekarza.
and in her
Wtedy
arms,
na
her son
jej
died.
rękach syn zmarł.
When I was 16 years old, I was learning and enjoying my life with my friends from high school. When Zygmunt Płoszko was 16 years old, he died fighting for the independence of his country. And this is why he deserves to be mentioned together with Piłsudski, Śmigły or Havel, because he made the biggest sacrifice, just like thousands of other people who are buried here.
Musimy pamiętać o jednym.
We must remember one
Wielka
thing.
ofiara, nie
Their great
poszła na marne.
sacrifice was not in vain.
Wszystko zakończyło
It all
się
ended in a great victory,
zwycięstwem.
and they are the
A
symbol
oni
of that
są symbolem
triumph.
tego zwycięstwa.
These people
Ci ludzie,
as we stand here today,
zasługują na to,
deserve for us to remember their suffering,
ale też na
but
to,
also
żeby
to
się
smile
uśmiechnąć nad tym,
for
co
everything
dzięki
we have now
im
because of
dzisiaj
them.
mamy.
I sometimes hear that we, the Polish people, like to dwell on pain, but I would disagree. Because although our history is filled with pain, we simply acknowledge the fight and struggle, but we still celebrate the past generations who allowed us to have a better future. I myself learn a lot during filming this program, and I encourage you to learn more with me. See you next time.